A confusing point for developers coming from different languages is the way variable scope behaves in JavaScript. So scope refers to the life cycle of a variable, i.e. where in the code it's visible and for how long. In JavaScript and C++, there is the concept of block level scope. We're going to be printing most of the stuff out to the console. So to use the plunker and execute it, you'll need to open up the browser console just like I've done, and then make sure you clicked on the console tab just to make sure that you're seeing the output of the script. So going back to the issue of block scope, in other languages, the code that exists in between these curly braces would be part of what's called a block. And the code that exists outside of these braces is not part of that block. This means that in those languages, if you declare a variable inside a block, it's only visible inside this block and any other nested blocks inside that block. But in ES5 JavaScript, we only have two scopes, the global scope and the function scope. So if I wrote this, those coming from a Java or C++ background might think that this would throw an error because we are trying to use the variable a outside of the block in which it was created in. But in JavaScript, this code is perfectly legal. That's because the variable a that we've declared inside this block exists in the global scope, and it exists for the lifetime of our application. So regardless of the fact that we declared a inside a block, it's visible everywhere, and that's why we can print it on line 4. And if we look in the terminal, we can see it actually has printed out the word block. In ES5, apart from global scope, the only other scope is function scope. So if we wrote this, and if we ran the above and it's already getting run automatically, we would see this error getting printed out to the console, which is uncaught reference error, a is not defined. That's because the a variable is now declared inside a function and is therefore only visible inside that function. Trying to access that variable from outside the function results in an error. That's what we mean by function level scope. If you declare a variable inside a function, it's only visible inside that function and it only exists for the lifetime of that function. But again, this isn't block level scope, as we can see if we add a for loop inside the function. So what did you expect to get printed out on line 8? Did you expect function or did you expect block? Those of you coming from other languages, such as C++ and Java, might have expected function to get printed out. But actually, from the console, we can see that the word block got printed out. This one here. And that's because, again, these curly braces don't signify block level scope. So this variable a, in fact, just overwrites the variable a in the function level scope. So when we print it out on number 8, all that's getting printed out is block. So this issue of no block level scope has plagued JavaScript developers since its inception. So one common workaround in the past has been to use something called an immediately invoked function expression, or IFE, like so. So now if you look at the console, we can see the word function is getting printed out. So if this syntax looks a little bit strange to you, just know it's in fact a shortcut way of writing. All we're doing here is we're declaring a function and then calling it straight away. So this declares a function, we wrap it in brackets, and then how do you call a function? Well, you use brackets. So what we're doing is we're executing this function straight away, and that's why it's called an immediately invoked function expression. And since functions have their own scope, using an IFE has the same effect as if we had block level scope. So the variable a inside the IFE isn't visible from outside of this function. And that's how JavaScript developers have been simulating block level scope for years and years and years. Ifs, immediately invoked function expressions, work, but it's a pretty long-winded way of solving this problem. So with ES6, we now have the new let keyword. We can use it in place of the var keyword, and it creates a variable with block level scope. So if we were to get rid of this iffy here and just replace var with let, then we can see function is getting printed out in the console. When we declare a variable with let, we are declaring that variable with block level scope. So this variable a is only visible between lines 4 to 6, between those curly braces. Outside of those curly braces on line 8, it's not visible. Only the var a is equal to function is visible. So there is a classic JavaScript interview questions which is used to test JavaScript developers' knowledge of the lack of block level scope. And it's this one. On line 1 we have an array called funcs. We're looping 1 to 10. Whatever the variable I is, we're storing on a variable called y. We're pushing a function. And what this function does is it just prints out the value of y. And then we loop through every item in functions. Remember, every item in function is a function, and then we're just executing that function. So basically, we're looping through all the functions, and then we're executing this function here. So what do you actually think is going to get printed out here? Yeah, spend like 5 seconds. Just really think about it. Really think what is going to get printed out here. Okay, let's see what gets printed out. So in the console, you can see that the number 9 gets printed 10 times. Chrome just combines all the same lines, outputs 10, 9. But really what's happening here is the number 9 is getting printed out 10 times. That's probably not what you expected. You probably expected the number 0, 0, and then 1, and then 2, and then 3. Probably expected those to get printed out in order. Because really what's happening here is, well, the variable I is incrementing by 1 each time through the loop. So really you should expect it to go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. But why is it printing out 9 10 times? The reason for this is that the variable y is not block level. It doesn't only exist inside this enclosing braces. Variable y actually exists in global scope. In fact, that's equivalent to saying this. So once we reach this point in our code here, what is the value of y? Well, the value of y is whatever the value of I was at the end of this loop. So the value here, y is going to be equal to 9. When we execute each function, that function is trying to log out the value of y. It's just printing out 9. But in this example, if we replace var y here with let y, this new y variable has block level scope, so it only exists between these two curly braces. And so when it gets executed, as you can see from the terminal, now 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 gets printed out, just as we expect. But this kind of problem, this kind of construct is so common that we can actually have an even bigger shortcut. We can declare the I inside the for loop with let, and then if we print that, yep, same as before, 0 to 9 gets printed out. And that's because even strictly this I is declared outside of this block level scope. Any variables declared in the for loop expression, this one here, with let, have block level scope within the enclosing curly braces. So in summary, let is a very important addition to the JavaScript language in ES6. It's not a replacement to var. var can still be used even in ES6 and has the same semantics and meaning as it did in ES5. However, unless you have a very specific reason to use var, I would expect all variables you define from this point on to use let.